All right, welcome everybody to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. I'm very happy that we have a good friend of ours, Richard Cook, who is Richard and I just started speaking somewhat recently. We published a few of his recent items on the Canadian Patriot site. I just got a little problem with my gallery view. And in getting to know Richard a little bit, looking at his background, his bio, buying his books, I was increasingly surprised and impressed of his very rich, unique background and career experience as somebody who was in a civil service, working in various departments of the U.S. government, all the way back from the times of Carter, becoming a whistleblower at NASA, which maybe in the Q&A something could be said about that, and advising people like Dennis Kucinich, who's good friends with Robert Kennedy and a major truth teller in our current day and age. It's a hard thing to find folks who are actually able to tell the truth in Washington D.C. But Kucinich was somebody who was and is able to still somehow manage to walk the walk inside the shadow realm and speak the truth. But Richard has, like I said, an incredible amount of experience. He's written already 3 books that are very interesting. The newest book has just been released. Richard will introduce us to some of that, what's been behind his thinking over the course of the years, his observations of America, and I hope the various pathways towards a future that restores some of the actual viable principal traditions of the Republic. So, Richard, thank you for taking the time, and the stage is yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Matthew. I've got a little, I'm reading from my own little summary of my book. So I'm going to look down now and then at what I've written. But first of all, I want to say that I'm extremely impressed by Matthew and Cynthia's output. They have a real online university on many subjects that I'm very familiar with and a lot of new things. So I just wanted to say that I don't want to have to sit for Matthew's final exam. I'm not so sure how well I would do, but on certain topics, I think we're very much aligned. My specialty is the history of the United States monetary system. I spent over 20 years at the US Treasury, and I'll talk a little bit about that. My career was as a federal government analyst on the civilian side of government. I'm familiar with the deep state by various contacts and, of course, my own study. But my career was in the civilian side of government. I'm going to first try to define where I'm coming from. And I'm going to start by saying I'm an American nationalist. And for some people, that waves all kinds of red flags, because anybody who's considered a nationalist today, if you look in Europe, for example, in different countries, oh, that's a label that immediately characterizes you as intolerant, right wing, and all that stuff. But I don't believe that. I believe that our nation should be living in peace and cooperation with the other nations of what we now know of as a multipolar world. I believe this was what was intended by the creation of the United Nations after World War II. And of course, the United Nations was created under the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. But Roosevelt died before the war was over, and things took a far different direction after that. And my book talks a little bit about that. Back when I was young, back in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, and believe me, I've been around for a long time, there was a famous book called The Family of Man. And I do say in my own book that I view my writing as a hymn to the family of man. Now, I do believe we have to take care of our own country, people, and environment, but then we have to reach out to others as having an equal standing with regards to life on our small planet. To do this, I think we have to honor the spiritual values of all of our respective faith traditions and develop from there. And I know that folks in Canada, in the US, and most of the countries, we're not the only melting pot in the United States. the whole world has become a melting pot, or if you will, the global village. I believe in the virtues of discipline, honesty, and hard work. I am a member of a Christian church, but I study and respect all the other major world religions. In fact, I worked with the guru from India and wrote a book about him at one time. You can find that on my author page in Amazon. It was called In the Footsteps of a Yogi. I am of European descent, but I also have Native American roots through my French-Canadian grandfather. And I write about him in my book also. I have African roots in my extended family. But of course, we all know there's a kind of spirituality that transcends and kind of ties together all the religions. So I'll say that I'm a follower of a German spiritual master. His name is Bo Yin Ra. I don't know if you've heard of him. But I also have family in Germany. I have 3 German-American grandchildren. So I have lots of connections throughout my life, through my family, through my work, through my contacts, which gives meaning to the phrase family of man to me. Now, as Matthew indicated, in my career, I worked for 5 different federal government agencies, including the Carter White House. It was back at a time when Carter was actually being voted out of office in the 1980 election against Reagan. I became a rather well-known, though I must say reluctant whistleblower at the time of the Challenger disaster in 1986. A cover-up had begun. I had worked directly on the problems that caused the Challenger disaster. And one day I took a whole batch of papers on the famous O-rings down to the New York Times, handed them over. The reporter said, "Hey, this is good stuff." They printed it, and that kind of exploded the whole story of what had caused the disaster. After leaving NASA, I spent 21 years at the US Treasury Department, where I learned the history of the United States financial system. I ended up actually developing and teaching courses in US monetary history, and I had a lot of assignments relating to financial security at a time when the entire financial system of the government and the US was converting to electronic funds transfer. So I have a lot of firsthand experience in that area. I saw all these changes firsthand. Going back a little bit, I'm a 1970 graduate of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I'm here today, as Matthew indicated, to talk about my latest book, which is going to be published by Clarity Press sometime, we hope, by Thanksgiving. We're working on the final proofs right now. The title is Our Country Then and Now. Okay, and there's the book title. Our Country Then and Now. And I'm going to talk, if you take a look at those 2 images on the cover, the top one is the Colonial Capitol building in Williamsburg, Virginia. It's a reconstructed building that I walked by hundreds of times when I lived there and went to college there. Down below is the United States Capitol in January and February of 2021, when there was barbed wire, razor wire, and armed guards around the Capitol during the second impeachment of Donald Trump. And so it's those 2 contrasting images that kind of form the bookends of my book. And I will talk a little bit about those 2 images. So, okay, thanks, Matthew, if you can go ahead and take that down. So, as I tell the story, I weave in 3 elements. One is my family history. My first ancestor, European ancestor, came over on the boat around 1636 from England, where he and his family were the victims of persecution by the Church of England. He was a Puritan. They landed in Massachusetts and gradually moved westward ending up in Oklahoma, Texas, and Montana. I was born in Montana myself, and so the family history is part of my story. The second part of it is a history of the United States, starting in the colonial days and going up until today, with the primary focus on political, but above all, economic and monetary history. So I have a whole history of the US monetary system and all the things that happened over the centuries, really, from the earliest days of Spanish dollars and Indian wampum and barter up until the catastrophe of today with the Federal Reserve System, the global economy, $23 trillion in public debt for the United States, and the money printing that is destroying the entire Western monetary system. So those are kind of the two events, periods of time that I kind of go through to try to explain how things got so bad, and they are bad. The third part of my book is as I mentioned, I have Native American ancestry, and where I was born in Montana is very close to the Flathead Indian Reservation. My parents both visited there. I've spent considerable amount of time there in the last couple of years. And so just to kind of illustrate the importance of the Native American experience to our history up to and including today, I go through the history of the Flathead Nation, the tribes that compose the Flathead Nation, what their background was, where they came from, and all the things that have happened to them in that part of the country from then until today. And I have good friends there today that have helped me write this history. So all of those strands are kind of woven together in one narrative. So if I could, let me kind of go through with you some of the approach that I'm taking to this history. Now, if you could go back, Matthew, to the book cover. Okay, on the top, this is the restored Colonial Capitol building in Williamsburg, Virginia. And as I mentioned there, I went to college there. My mother was a tour guide in Williamsburg for 25 years. I actually played a clarinet, an 18th century clarinet, in the colonial band that Colonial Williamsburg had put together. But the significance of the reconstructed Capitol, this is where the motion for American independence, US independence, originated in 1776, because it was from there that what was called the Virginia Convention sent instructions to their delegates at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, ordering them to introduce the independence motion for what became the United States. The motion was introduced by a delegate named Peyton Randolph. And as we know, another Virginia delegate, Thomas Jefferson, wrote the Declaration of Independence. So that's the first photo on the cover. The second, as I mentioned, is a photo of the US Capitol taken in Washington, D.C. in January 2021. The Capitol is surrounded by a high fence with razor wire and armed soldiers at the time of the second Donald Trump impeachment. So we can see from this what a change, how many changes we've witnessed in the 245 years from independence to the divisions that are destroying the United States today. So one purpose of my book is to tell the story of how we've gotten into such a state of discord, to try to show what has happened, why it has happened, and what I believe we have to do now. So let me talk a little bit about what my approach is then in the book. As I mentioned, we start with the monetary system in colonial days when trade was carried on with barter Spanish gold dollars, Indian wampum, and promissory notes that were either backed by land or a commodity like tobacco, and British mercantile credit, because the colonies of North America became very deeply indebted to the merchants of London, who gave them credit at rather high interest rates to finance the trade. So from the very beginning, there was a tremendous outflow of all available money from the colonies to London. And this was one of the chief causes of the American Revolution. And in order to combat that, the colonies printed their own money. And they would always do it with a commodity as a basis, either land, like the Philadelphia Land Bank, or like tobacco, as in Virginia, where you would take your tobacco to a warehouse and you would get a certificate then, which acted as money. But in 1767, the Parliament outlawed all colonial currency. It immediately resulted in a very deep depression that lasted all the way up until the Revolution. Now, when the Revolution began, and actually began in 1775, but in 1776 came the Declaration of Independence, and the Congress at that time began to print what was called continental currency. It was printing press money, and it was used mainly to pay soldiers and to pay for the equipment and the commodities, the agricultural products that were used to feed the army in the field. And this money, because it was not backed by gold or silver, which all printed money at the time was supposed to be, it was supposed to be redeemable in gold or silver. This was just floating paper currency. And that's why you have the saying, not worth a continental, because it quickly deteriorated in value. And this became even worse when the British, on their warships in the New York harbor, began to counterfeit it. And this also contributed to the deterioration of the value of that money. But that was the first government paper money in North America. And it lasted throughout the war. But late in the Revolutionary War, one of the leading figures of the revolution created in Philadelphia the Bank of North America. And this was the first banking institution in this country. And what he did was, with the base of a certain amount of gold and silver as his reserve base, he began to issue paper money also. It was bank issued money, and it was redeemable in gold and silver. And of course, it had a lot more value than did the continental currency. So that was kind of the beginning of the currency system in the United States. Now, we then go into a detailed discussion of money, credit, and banking. And I talk about what I have a section in chapter 2 that's called constitutional confusion. And what I mean by constitutional confusion is the US Constitution gives Congress the authority to coin money and establish its value. The government under the Constitution may also borrow money and levy taxes. There is no mention anywhere in the Constitution of paper money. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton, who was the first US Secretary of the Treasury, wanted no provision at all for the government to be able to issue paper notes, as they had done with the continental currency. Now, the issuance of paper notes is also expressly forbidden in the Constitution to the states. But even with coinage, there is no mention of how the coinage is to be introduced into trade. Unlike in Europe, the federal government did not undertake to mine gold or silver, which could then be introduced into circulation as currency. But early on, we established a US mint at Philadelphia. And with the mint, the gold and silver that miners pulled out of the ground, and it usually passed into the hands of brokers, they would take their bullion to the mint, and for a small fee to cover costs, the US Mint would create coinage from that bullion. They would actually stamp coins and give those to the people who brought the gold and silver in, and those people who brought it in could then use it as spending money. And so obviously the people who mined gold or silver or who brokered it and brought it to the mint became very wealthy, important, and powerful people in the early economy of the United States. There was a value ratio that the government established by law for gold versus silver. And the ratio was 15 units of gold 15 units of silver equaled 1 unit of gold. So the ratio was 15 to 1. And you can see today with the tremendous inflation of gold prices and the relative collapse of silver prices, that ratio has not held up. But the idea that gold and silver could be interchangeable at a reasonable ratio was part of the monetary system of the United States for a century or more, even up until the 20th century. So from all this, you can see that there was always a mad rush for gold whenever it appeared in the world. And in the US, we had gold rushes periodically. Of course, the biggest one was 1848. And after the 1848 gold rush, the next mint was built in San Francisco. So that was the beginning of the monetary system. But everybody knew back then that coinage was not enough. And that despite the fact that the Constitution didn't give the government the right to print and spend money, paper money was needed. And Alexander Hamilton himself was keenly aware of that need, particularly because he had the concept that the government should sponsor the construction of what they called internal improvements. That is, the infrastructure that would make possible industrialization in the country as a whole. The two main improvements they were talking about back then were canals and roads, because in order to have any kind of commerce or industry, you had to have a good transportation system. And Hamilton saw, as other people had seen elsewhere in the world before then, particularly in France, that it was the job of the central government to create that infrastructure to support industrialization. So the chosen vehicle became banking. Now, when you think about banking, you have to think about how banks create money. Banks create money through fractional reserve banking. This was a system that had been developed in Europe with roots in medieval gold dealing. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. People with gold would take it to a broker, to a goldsmith, or to somebody who had a secure vault and leave it there for safekeeping. In exchange, the gold dealer would give them a paper certificate. And this paper certificate circulated in Europe all throughout the Middle Ages and the late and the Renaissance period as money. Now, here's where the fractional reserve aspect came in, because they got the idea that, gee, we've got a certain amount of gold. Why don't I just issue more certificates than I have gold? So the gold itself became a reserve against which paper certificates were issued. And the reserve requirement for the amount of gold you had to have varied greatly throughout history, to the point where you don't have to have any reserve today. The banks can just print all the money the market will bear, and that's one of the big problems that we have. But these certificates would circulate as money, both locally and internationally. Now, the problem came when everybody who held a certificate showed up at the gold dealers and wanted gold. And if they didn't have it, the system would collapse. And gold dealers back in those days could even be executed if they failed to meet depositor demands. But this was a system that gradually developed. The first place to perfect the system was Venice, back in the late Middle Ages. It passed to Florence and the other Italian city-states, and it passed into Germany with the Fugger family, who became the big bankers in southern Germany. And gradually that system passed throughout Europe until it reached Holland, and the whole Dutch mercantile system was built on fractional reserve banking run by the banks of Amsterdam. And then with the glorious revolution in England, it passed across the English Channel to be adopted by the what was then created as the Bank of England in the late 1600s. And the entire modern system of banking is now built upon fractional reserve banking. And of course, the flaw is that you can issue more money than you have reserve for most of all of the 1900s and much of the 20th century, the 1800s and then the 1900s. You had a gold or a gold and silver standard, so you still had monetary backing, but the banks always got far out in front of the available gold and silver, called specie, to be able to redeem if conditions got tight. And so we had constantly recurring panics, as they were called, in the 19th century, when the currency simply collapsed because of the overextension of lending. And a lot of that lending was for speculation. A lot of it was so that people could borrow and speculate mainly on land. Land speculation was a huge addiction and a huge craze throughout the 19th century. And these recurrent panics creating depressions always meant that every 10 years, every 20 years, the entire financial system would simply collapse because they could not redeem the paper money that they were printing. So this is the big flaw in fractional reserve banking, and it has not been solved to this day. Now, the problem came when governments had to borrow money from the banks or sell bonds to the public in order to finance their operations. Because even from the 1790s, when the US Constitution went into effect, the government almost immediately went into debt because they could not pay for their operations. And most of the government operations then was for the Army and the Navy. And the US was fighting wars almost from the very beginning, including the Revolution and then on into the War of 1812. And so the government continually went into debt. And because it had to go into debt, it had to borrow money through the banks from people who were wealthy enough to buy government bonds in order to fight their wars. And this happened not only in Europe, but it happened in the United States. And when you depend on bankers to fight for the money to fight your wars, you are in big trouble, because the bankers will always try to foment wars in order to get you to borrow to make them rich while the people paid. And this is a system that was put in place in Europe. It passed to the United States. It continues to exist today. In fact, the main reason the Federal Reserve System was created in 1913 was so that the United States could finance World War I by lending money created through the fractional reserve system to France and to Great Britain. So it's a system we've been saddled with ever since. And I write about all this in the book. There's a whole history of how all this happened and down to very great detail. Now, something really interesting happened when the United States Civil War began. The United States Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865. And until then, the United States was mainly an agrarian economy. We lived on farming. We lived on agricultural exports to Europe. Industry was just beginning during that time. It began with the development of the iron industry when they started to dig iron ore and coal out of the Appalachian Mountains. But when the Civil War began, and suddenly the North, headed by President Abraham Lincoln, was faced with a rebellion in the South generated by the slave-owning aristocracy, suddenly Lincoln had to put an army in the field of tens of thousands of people. He had no money. There were people who were willing to fight. The government had the ability to manufacture weapons, but you couldn't pay for it. So what did they do? Well, the first thing Lincoln did was to go to the bankers of New York to try to float bonds and borrow the money. And the bankers of New York at that time were very much in league with a very famous banking family that everybody's familiar with called the Rothschilds. The big Rothschild representative in the United States was August Belmont. Belmont became the chairman of the Democratic Party. And so during the Civil War. And so banking and party politics became very closely linked during this period, and again, still is today. Well, when Lincoln went to the bankers, they were going to charge him interest rates for loans to finance his war of from 30 to 50%, because the credit of the US government was so bad. They weren't even sure the US government would survive the war. The Confederacy was trying to bring in Britain and France on their side. So, why would a bank lend money to a failing enterprise? Well, good questions. And so what the federal government did then, the Union, was they began, as they had done during the Revolutionary War, to print and spend money into circulation. Except this time it was much more secure. It was much less susceptible to counterfeiting. And there was a promise that sometime in the future, the government would redeem the money for silver and gold. Now, this money was called greenbacks. And Lincoln was so dedicated to this form of financing that he called greenbacks the people's currency. And the politicians at the time were quite clear that the greenbacks had saved the Union. Greenbacks were so popular that even though the government tried repeatedly in future years to take them out of circulation, there were still greenback bills in circulation in the United States until 1950, which is a pretty amazing fact. Very few people realize. But it was this currency that circulated that made business possible, that did not incur any debt to the bankers, that was really the backbone of the US financial system from the Civil War through the rest of the century. But at the same time, the banks continued to gain power. And the big event during this period was 1863, when the National Banking Act was passed. Now, the significance of the National Banking Act was, A, they would themselves distribute paper currency, but B, they used as their reserve base not specie, not gold or silver. They had some, but not enough to back the currency. So what they used was US government treasury bonds purchased on credit. And so treasury bonds or US government debt became the backbone of the fractional reserve banking system, and it still is today. If you remember the recent crisis where the banks, two or three major banks in the US crashed because they couldn't redeem depositors' funds, had as their reserve base US Treasury bonds. It was a key system that mortgaged the country essentially to the fractional reserve banking system by virtue of the fact that they didn't have to come up with anything of tangible value to back the currency. They just had to borrow from the federal government or take what the federal government had deposited as their reserve currency base. And that's the system that we still have today. So you had side by side throughout the rest of the 1800s, the development of the banking system side by side with the greenback currency that had saved the Union. You got into the late 1900s and you began to have the growth of industry, the growth of government military forces when they started building a huge navy of ironclad ships. And so the demand on funding became greater and greater, and it produced a greater dependence of the government on the banking system. At the same time, industry was being consolidated by the increasingly wealthy banking system under what they called the money trust. And the big name in the money trust at that time was J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan and the Morgan banks were linked hand in hand with the Rothschild interests in London to form a tremendous cartel that over the next 20 years gained so much power that they crashed the system in the Panic of 1907. And as a result, they created the Federal Reserve Bank and the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The Federal Reserve System is not a government-owned system. It's a banking system that's owned by the member banks. And the biggest member banks at that time were the Morgan Rothschild banks. And these were the banks that were used by Britain and France to finance the First World War, because Britain knew that there was no way they could raise the money themselves to fight and destroy Germany, with whom they had a tremendous commercial rivalry. And because Britain had always, through its long history, gone to war against any continental power that seemed to threaten its commercial dominance, Germany was the next one up for destruction. And this destruction was accomplished through the First World War and then through the Second World War. And it was done by Britain essentially taking control of the financial system of the United States. Now, I know that Matthew and Cynthia have written a lot about the system of currency that came from Cecil Rhodes and Nathaniel Rothschild, who gained control of the diamond and gold fields of South Africa after they defeated the Dutch in the Boer Wars. And they had as one of their objectives the recovery of the United States for the British Empire. And so all of these different things kind of pulled together around the time of the First World War. And Britain did, in fact, regain the United States for the British Empire through the First World War and on into the period following. But a funny thing happened when the Bank of England caused the Great Depression. And I write about this in great detail, and it has to do with the manipulation of gold and the creation of the gold standard, which was the method of control that the Bank of England and the Rothschild used to control the system. What happened was that the Bank of England caused the depression, but we had a president at that time, Franklin Roosevelt, who decided that the existence of the United States as a nation state was more important than the banking system. And so Roosevelt, and he did it, of course, by heavy borrowing, heavy sales of government debt instruments, essentially recreated the nationalist system that Lincoln had first set up that brought the US out of the Great Depression. And during that time, the Rockefeller family, which of course had become rich and famous with the Standard Oil monopolies, and had moved into banking and had helped create the Federal Reserve System, fought a war against the Morgans and Rothschilds for control of US financing, the US financial system, and thereby the US governmental system. The Roosevelts or the Rockefellers took over the banking system during the Great Depression, and with Roosevelt and later Truman, created the national security state that we have today. And very few people realize that when you talk about where did the CIA come from or where did the National Security Agency come from, it came from the Rockefeller control, the Rockefeller family. And they used those agencies to begin to expand overseas. They overthrew the government of Iran in 1953. They overthrew the government of Guatemala in 1954. They later took out the next nationalist president, who was John F. Kennedy. They took him out and cast their web across the entire modern era of the United States and turned it into the globalist neoliberal regime that we have today. And you can trace the way that the banking system gradually spread out in world conquest, and this was a conscious objective of theirs, and brought us to where we are today. Today, the war on terror, and now today, the Ukraine war. All of this is a result of the takeover of the financial system and the creation of the national security state under the Rockefellers during the latter part of the 20th century and on into today. So that's a very, very brief overview of what my book is about. And so I guess it might be a good time to stop and see if anybody has any questions or comments.
Yes, that is a thank you very much for that brushstroke. And I think that provides the context that I think people need, and that's often lacking when people try to go into unpacking one element of history or another element that interests them. There's often a lacking of a structure of the whole in the mind, right? That this part of the puzzle is just a part of. So I think what you've done by painting this entire brushstroke of the pre-American Revolution, the entire fight leading up to creating a sovereign currency, the cause of the booms and busts that never needed to really happen, all the way to the current crisis. That's very good. I got a couple of questions, but I'm gonna open up first for anybody who has, like usual, what I usually ask is for people to write their name in the chat box, to share a thought or a question. I'll call upon you in queue, or you can put your digital hand up as well, and I can call upon you that way. So Stephen would like to kick the ball off here. Stephen, go for it.
Hi, Richard. Thanks very much for an interesting historical background in terms of the generalities of banking and fractional reserve, especially. I'm wondering, with your knowledge of Federal Reserve and monetary history, are you a silver stacker? What do you see the future of silver in terms of U.S. and money? Because I noticed that President Trump on a couple of times has tweeted about silver, which I found interesting. And do you have any knowledge in terms of JFK and I think it was Executive Order 1110 in silver? I'm just wondering what your thoughts today on silver vis-a-vis U.S. money supply.
Yeah, the Kennedy's issuance of silver certificates was not really a revolution in monetary affairs. It was kind of tidying up some existing legislation. It didn't result in a lot of money being distributed. In fact, Douglas Dillon at that time was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he was such an establishment figure that there was no way Dillon would have agreed to revolutionize the monetary system. But silver has always been there as a commodity that the United States has hoarded, but they've relied less and less on silver to the point where it's very depressed. There was a time back in the 1990s, I think, maybe the 80s, when some traders tried to corner the market on silver, and essentially it crashed it. And I actually knew a silver miner. I know a silver miner in Idaho, and the price of silver today is so depressed that whether it's ever going to come back and mean anything, it's very difficult to say. And of course, the price of gold being so inflated as it is a sign of the weakness of the paper dollar. And so you have nations like Russia and China now trying to build their gold stocks. And I don't know if anybody will ever return to redemption of gold as a backing for money, but it's always going to be of value. And so any country that has an inclination for a commodity-backed money, the way these BRICS nations are moving toward, gold is going to be a valuable commodity. But it's always going to be subject to market forces because the government no longer regulates it. So that's my view on that.
Okay, thank you.
I can't predict whether silver will ever come back. It'd be nice if it did.
Yuri, you want to go for it? You're on mute, by the way. Everyone is on mute by default.
Yeah, now I read, I can't remember where I read it. It might have been one of your articles, Matthew, but it was either Putin or Glaziev that had stated that the Russians were going to be allowing Islamic banking in some of the Central Asian regions. And I understand that they don't allow usury. They allow sort of they still have a way of getting a sort of interest. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But I think the general idea is that they don't allow usury. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that or knew anything more about it.
Yeah, the Islamic system of banking, it's a little bit of a hybrid between a bank and the stock market, because what a bank does is it invests by lending into the actual enterprise, and so they're helping the enterprise to get up and running and produce a profit, and they get some profit sharing out of it. But there's no obligation to repay the loan if the enterprise fails. The Islamic banking system is a tremendous system, and that's one of the sources of strength of some of the BRICS nations. And if that were running as a system in Central Asia, it's a great way to finance development. Because the bank shares the burden of success with the enterprise. Of course, the bank then has to be really careful that they're going to have a successful enterprise.
Right.
But what this does is it eliminates lending for speculation. If you look at the US stock market and see how much of the stock market has borrowing invested into it, you realize how precarious that is. Because if the stock market goes down a little bit, like it did, obviously, in 1929, the people who borrowed, it's called on margin, can't repay their loans and the whole system crashes. And we are in that precarious place today. Plus, you have all of the derivatives. The currency swaps and all that stuff. The banks lend billions of dollars to essentially gambling casinos and speculators for these uses. And there is so much debt overhang. Warren Buffett, whose name we all know, said that derivatives are a weapon of mass destruction, a WMD. And he's right. And that's one of the reasons the West is in such a panic, the US and NATO and everybody, over BRICS, is that our debt overhang is so tremendous that if our overseas lending disappears, nobody buys our treasury bonds anymore, this whole system is subject to a collapse. It happened in 2008, 2009. And then with quantitative easing, when the Federal Reserve began to buy US government securities, because no one else would buy them because they were worthless.
Right.
That's what we're in now. We are in that bubble, in the late stages of that bubble. It's a very, very precarious situation. Islamic banking has defeated that issue, and again, that's another reason why the U.S. is so intent on taking down the economies of the Islamic nations and the independent BRICS nations.
That's very interesting.
We're just not allowing speculation to get out of control.
Yeah. Can I do a further question?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Pretty short. I read that Thomas Jefferson said there were two things in the Constitution that were missing. One was there was no limits on the Supreme Court. I guess it wasn't democratic. And then the other one was he wanted corporations to only exist as a contract. In other words, you want to build a bridge, well, then you write up a contract, and then you create a contract for that bridge. And once the bridge is built, your corporation is dissolved. Do you know anything about Thomas Jefferson's views on that?
Well, again, it's a very conservative approach to finance, and in fact, that's pretty much the way the system was set up over time in practice, not so much by the federal government, but by the states and localities, because the federal government continued pretty much all the way through the 1800s. The main thing they spent money on was the Army and the Navy. They did not spend money on infrastructure and economic development. That was done by the private sector, but it was also done by the states and localities by selling bonds. And again, that's like what Jefferson was talking about. That was a temporary business set up to finance a project. That's how the Erie Canal was built.
Amazing.
They set up a public-private corporation. They sold bonds. They built the Erie Canal and then left it to the Erie Canal Authority to operate. But then the financing system was done, so they ceased operations. The investors got paid off, and that was it. So,
well, just imagine that if Jefferson's idea was still in place, since the United States is now a corporation, we can declare that well, you finished your job and dissolve the United States.
Yeah, could happen.
It's just a joke, not a very good one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great answers.
Yeah.
On the issue of the Islamic banking and Shia bank, I forget the name of what it's called again. The Islamic banking system. Was that what the gold dinar was based upon, that Gaddafi was ushering in 2009 or so? Was that premised on Sharia banking? Yeah. Was that based on those types of practices when he was talking about developing the great water system and stuff?
I'm sure it was. He was really, really big on infrastructure development. And by creating a gold-based currency outside of the influence of Western financial reserve banking, that's why they destroyed Libya over that issue, for sure.
Monty.
And that's in my book, by the way.
Great.
Got a section on
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Cook. I just happened to be reading. I'm not sure if you're familiar with William Zoll or Will Zoll. He's been writing a series of articles called Prussiagate, and he wrote the 5th chapter on this just today. It came out, The Collapse of a Complex Enemy, in which he was, throughout the series, he developed much the same thing on the history of the banking and the monetary systems and the Species Act and so forth. And as with a lot of these characters, they get into faulting Roosevelt for making gold illegal in the 1930s and fixing the price, whereas people couldn't own money. And that, of course, led the collapse of that system up to 1971 when we went to the petrodollar.
Right.
And my understanding of this also is the system is so set up now that we actually require increasing debt in order to sustain this bubble. And with this increasing debt, of course, it's facilitated by war. Could you address this a bit insofar as this perpetual war is actually necessary under the present system in order to sustain the bubble?
Right. First on Roosevelt, he had no choice in 1932 when he got the U.S. Domestic system off gold, because gold was controlled by the Bank of England. In fact, every weekday morning during that era, down in the city of London, in the Rothschild bank offices, they'd have a little meeting first thing in the morning to set the price of gold for that day. And the US was not part of that system. And that was the system that the Bank of England used to crash the world economy in 1929. And Roosevelt had to get out of that. The US could not survive while it was still beholden to the gold standard that was run by the Bank of England. So what they did was they disengaged from the gold standard, and that allowed a tremendous expansion of the U.S. currency to essentially pay for World War II. And that was done under the heading of John Maynard Keynes, who said that, well, the problem is that all the rich people are hoarding money and pulling money out of the system and putting into savings and their own investments. The only way that you can overcome that is by selling treasury bonds to them to pull that money back into circulation. And so that's where the whole Keynesian system of deficit financing came into play. Now, that system continued through World War II and on into the 1950s. But by the 1950s, the United States economy had begun to decline. We were getting a balance of payments deficit because Germany and Japan mainly were coming back into activity from their wartime devastation. And so we were actually starting to go into a depression in the late 1950s. And this is why when John Kennedy became president, he said, we have to go back to a nationalistic economy based on industrial growth, productivity growth, to recover our economy instead of just printing more money that we borrow from rich people. And one of the main measures that Kennedy put in place was low interest rates, because he saw that so long as you are siphoning huge profits off into the banking system through economic activity, the banking system would be the ones who control the economy, not the industrial plant of the nation. So he was for low interest rates, capital investment, and his big opponent was David Rockefeller, who wrote a series of articles against Kennedy in Life magazine, and we all see how that worked out, right? We saw how the Kennedy presidency worked out. And coming out of that, the big power in the United States economy was David Rockefeller and the Chase Manhattan Bank, because he was the leader of a petroleum investment abroad and taking over petroleum in Saudi Arabia, Iran, everywhere else. But he was also in favor of investing huge amounts of printed money, credit in less developed countries. And this began the long series of crashes of the economies of Latin America, of the Middle East, of East Asia, that went on for 40 years. because the banks would lend tremendous amounts of money to them. Then the Federal Reserve would come along and raise interest rates, and all these countries would go broke. And if you look at the book about economic hitmen that was pretty famous here not too long ago, Perkins in there describes the whole process of predatory lending to less developed countries. And obviously, if you're playing these games with less developed countries, and you have the International Monetary Fund coming along and saying, well, we'll lend you even more money as long as A, you fire half your public employees, B, you convert to export commodities instead of subsistence farming and all that stuff. Obviously, we need a huge military machine to keep all those countries in line. So we invade Grenada, we invade Iraq, we invade Panama, we invade X, Y, and Z. And then after, quote, 9/11, we start invading a whole lot of other people. So the whole war machine is based on keeping control over other nations so that we can lend them money and extract profits from their economy. And this is what the whole international banking system is based on. And it's based on that today. And look at Ukraine. Ukraine is supposed to be a cash cow for Western banking and Western hedge funds that come in there and buy land, buy farms, buy mines, buy everything, except finally somebody said, no, you can't do that anymore. And that man was Putin. And now we have a big war over it. But it's all over economic control, banking control, fractional reserve banking, speculation in commodities, and all the rest. So it all ties together.
Adam said,
All
"Are
right,
you there?"
I am here.
Yes.
You kind of touched on the ideas a little bit, but I was wondering if you could comment specifically on the idea of modern monetary theory and its what I think are pretty obvious shortcomings.
Yeah, that's a good one, because there's been a big fight going on in the Green Party. Because I don't know if you're familiar with Dennis Kucinich's, it's called the NEED Act, N-E-E-D. The NEED Act, which Kucinich introduced in Congress in 2011, and I'm kind of telling a little bit of a story about this, but I'll get to your question. The NEED Act derived from proposals made by the American Monetary Institute that a good friend of mine named Steve Zarlinga set up back in the early 2000s. And I knew Zarlinga very well. He and I were good friends, and he and I actually worked together on putting together legislation that would essentially recreate the greenback system for the modern age. The funny thing happened was, again, I'm telling a bit of a story. Steve came to my office in Washington one day. We had a scheduled meeting, and he had along with him this young lady who was his assistant at the time. She was British, and her name was Elizabeth. And I had arranged for a meeting between Steve and Kucinich up on Capitol Hill. So Steve and Elizabeth went up to Capitol Hill to meet with Kucinich, and lo and behold, Kucinich and Steve's assistant Elizabeth got married several months later. So they formed a very powerful coalition of monetary reformers. And Steve, Dennis, and Elizabeth, and I had worked with Steve on this, put together legislation that Kucinich actually introduced in Congress in 2011 for the modern greenback system. And it's in my book. It's in the appendix, actually. So I hope you take a look at that. But a funny thing happened after he introduced that legislation. The powers that be in Congress rewrote the congressional districts in Ohio, where Kucinich was from, and lo and behold, his congressional district disappeared. So he was out of Congress after he introduced this legislation. And he's never been able to get back. But fortunately now we have Dennis with his tremendous talents as RFK Jr.'s campaign manager. And we'll see where that goes. But anyway, the Green Party, and at that time I was working pretty closely with the Green Party in the US, actually adopted Kucinich's Need Act as their monetary platform. And now they're very big proponents of it. A guy named Howard Switzer, who's the head of the Alliance for Just Money, that's also referenced in my book. You can look him up. They are big proponents of greenback funding, or the reintroduction of a greenback system in the modern US economy, which would totally revolutionize everything, economics, geopolitics, everything. It's the only way the United States can survive, in my opinion. The present crisis is by this type of a reformation of the monetary system. Well, I'm not sure who the modern monetary theorists are. I think they're probably part of the deep state, but they've come up with this system where, oh, government borrowing, that doesn't matter. It's real money. It'll get paid off someday, blah, blah, blah. And they tried to take over the Green Party. So there was this big battle between the Kucinichites in the Green Party and the modern monetary theorists. And as far as I know right now, the Green Party still is abiding by the platform based upon Kucinich's Need Act. But it's been pretty interesting to watch. But as far as I'm concerned, the modern monetary theorist is fake. And I ran into those people when I was out there promoting my book on monetary theory. I had this one guy, every time I would post something, this one guy would come on and just debunk it. He would just take me to the cleaners for what I was saying with these ridiculous arguments. And you know that somebody out there is paying this guy to do that. They did the same thing with my Challenger book. I guess they're the trolls of the world, but in reality, the deep state has quite a large number of people on the payroll who just attack anything that possibly could threaten their control. And that's what I think of the modern monetary theory. Hope I'm not going too much off the deep end on that.
No, and I appreciate that sort of insider's view of it. That was a real down and dirty analysis.
Take a look, though, in my book at the appendix. Obviously, I hope everybody reads my book. Take a look at the appendix, and I go a little bit into the theory and background of this.
I will.
Yeah, for anybody looking into the book, I included a link in the chat box, and there's going to be a link online for anybody watching this on YouTube. Go to the description box under this video, and you can access Richard's book on Clarity Press. On the issue of MMT, the modern monetary theory, how is it different? Because I'm trying to also wrap my mind around it a little bit, and yeah, I really appreciate your insight into it. But I was wondering, like, how is it different from Keynesianism? And because it seems like there's parallels to it, but it seems like there's parallels. It seems almost like a doppelganger in some ways of the American system of Hamilton in some way, except it's devoid of any of the actual organizing principles of value that Hamilton wrote about, understood, and people like Matthew Carey, Henry C. Carey, they always bounded their idea of what productive credit should be based upon certain rational, real-world discoverable concepts that would bound the money system so that you couldn't just infinitely print money without certain real-world organizing principles. Can you speak a little bit more about the differences or similarities to this, to either Keynes or the American system?
Hamilton knew that you had to create credit for development. I mean, that's just kind of a fundamental principle that he understood. Now, where would that come from? I think when you're talking about Hamilton, it's good to go back and refer to France under Louis XIV, because that was the big period of French development. It's called the Grand Siècle, the great century. But the government of Louis XIV did that by very heavy taxation. And that taxation came in specie, in gold and silver. And so he had a big monetary base of specie because France was wealthy. They had a lot of trade. They also dug the gold and silver out of the ground and turned that into money. And that was the basis on which they created credit. They wouldn't just hand a developer gold and silver. They would hand him a contract, like this other gentleman mentioned, to do a certain project. And those projects were largely in transportation. And that's where France got such a great transportation system that it carried all the way into modern times, the roads, the bridges, the canals, all of that. So you needed a system of credit, but you had to base it on something. You have to base it on real production. And it's the production that comes from the use of credit that is the tangible backing of, it's called de registre system. It's based on the physical plant and productivity of the physical economy. And that's where Lyndon LaRouche was such a great theorist. He understood that the real backing for a monetary system isn't necessarily gold or silver. That was a substitute for a while. But the real backing is the actual tangible physical assets that investment and credit creates. It's not just speculation. It's not just gambling. That, you know, tomorrow the British pound will be a little bit higher, so we're going to buy cheap today and sell pounds tomorrow. That's George Soros economics. And it's a disaster. But the whole idea of the American system that Kerry and everybody talked about is you use credit to create a physical functioning economy. That's where the real value comes from. And it's the work that goes in to creating that economy that is the source of national wealth and national well-being and national pride and every other positive virtue. Now, where Hamilton didn't understand was he thought that if you just set up a bank that makes loans, all of this is going to come about. But if you look at the real history of the first bank of the United States, every loan that they made to private parties had a 30 to 60 day repayment period. You can't build infrastructure with 30 to 60 day loans. So most of those loans are either for business operations where a merchant, would buy a boatload of commodities coming over from England and then sell them in his shops. So a 30 to 60 day loan could help him to do that. Or a lot of that went into land speculation, an awful lot, where you would buy 50 acres of land and then you'd break it down into lots and you'd make a bunch of money and pay your loan back in 60 days. So he didn't understand the limitations of fractional reserve banking. The main function and benefit of the first Bank of the United States was it was a depository for federal revenues coming in from the customs duties that were the main source of revenue. And it was the paymaster for government expenditures, mainly Army and Navy. So it served a purpose. But in the meantime, the people who bought the stock in the First National Bank, and they bought mostly on credit, 20% had to be in specie, but 80% was just paper. When they turned around and sold their shares at a substantial profit, they made out like bandits and didn't really benefit the nation. So it was a well-intentioned early effort to set up a credit system, but it had these limitations. And it really wasn't until I think the first big infrastructure project by the federal government was the building of the National Road in the 1920s and 30s. that they began to understand, then you got to invest long term. And then again, the Erie Canal was a big prototype. Then later on, the railroads were built on credit. So you have to have a credit system, but it has to result in physical, tangible productivity. If all it is speculation and profiteering, you'll destroy your economy. And we've done that today.
Thank you. Yuri has a follow-up question. Yuri, you wanna ask that?
Yes, I'm wondering if this has always fascinated me. There's a movement called distributism. Apparently, it's based on Pope Leo the 13th's an encyclical. It was based on Catholic social teaching, and I'm wondering if information is kind of scarce and hard to get about it. I'm wondering if you have any ideas on distributism as an economic model. Basically, what is the way I understand it, what they want to do is to make capitalists out of everybody. In other words, the means of production should be owned by everybody. It should be fully distributed. Do you know about this movement, and does it make any economic sense?
It does. I mean, if you,
I like it.
I know that if I mention Russia as an example, I'm risking all kinds of problems. Not with this group, but out there in the big wide world today. But look at Russia. When it was socialist, communist, the government owned everything. They owned the department store. They owned your apartment. They owned everything. And of course, that system died in 1989. When Gorbachev went before the United Nations in 1989 and said, we are not a communist nation anymore. That's done. And of course, the Soviet Union as a state collapsed 2 years later in 1991. But what happened was that they took all of the state-owned enterprise and they just sold them off, the pennies on the dollar, and that became the oligarchs, the famous oligarchs that were all in the group. And that was facilitated by US Harvard-trained economists.
Right, Sachs.
Shock therapy.
Right.
And the Russian economy collapsed, totally collapsed. There was no money. There were no jobs. People were starving because the oligarchs had taken the money and run. And that was a gigantic real estate boom in London because they took their laundered money to London and bought mansions. But anyway, that was a catastrophe. So what happened? What happened was that when Putin came in, he made the oligarchs start to pay taxes, and if they refused, they were out, literally exiled, some of them worse. But he created a hybrid economy where the select businesses, and it's not every business, for example, the best example is Gazprom, the big Russian oil gas company. That's now a hybrid. It's essentially government owned, but that's because the government owns 50% of the stock. The other 50% or 49% or whatever it is owned by private companies, private investors, including American and Canadian and British companies. They're all invested in the state-owned enterprise. So he's created a hybrid. The Bank of Russia is state-owned. That is not a privately owned banking system. And so the government can say, whoa, no speculation loaning. And the bank says, you're right, we'll do that. A lot of the enterprise in Russia is privately owned. But it's one thing to have your gas company a public-private hybrid, and another thing to have your hamburger joints. There's no reason the government has to own the hamburger joints. But the idea of I'm not that familiar with the details. I am familiar to some extent with historical papal encyclicals, which have always come down on the side of a fair economy.
Yeah.
An economy that includes the people as the beneficiaries of the economic system, and not just the oligarchs and the plutocrats. So, and of course, as you probably know, there's a tremendous Catholic workers movement
Yeah.
that was created in New York City and has branched out from there that I think is a tremendously positive
Mhm.
thing. So yeah, I think
Well, I think
boundaries are way.
the distributors highly value property rights, so they consider those fundamental. And the idea is to spread the means of production equally everywhere. I don't know how you do that. Like you said, with the Russian example, the oligarchs took it all. So, I mean, the Russians wanted to spread everything, so you owned your apartment. I think the apartment ownership, I think that has actually worked out pretty well. I think most Russians own their own apartments. So on that,
Yeah, excuse me,
yeah.
if you delve into the Need Act, the Kucinich Need Act, um, it puts credit control in the hands of the central government, and people will just totally freak out if you
Right.
that's what you're advocating. The government making economic decisions. Well, if the government is we the people, truly we the people, then yes,
Yeah.
uh, educated, rational, compassionate people making credit decisions where we realize we need to totally revamp our railroad system, our railroad passenger system, and they put the money and the credit into that. Yeah, that's great. It benefits everybody. So I'm very much in favor of the principles of the distributive system.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think it's very, very.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Can I ask you to maybe put a little bit of meat on the bone? And obviously, I'm going to be reading your book and really focusing on that appendix. But I'd like to know, with the current banking system being what it is, sitting on this giant bubble that is bursting at the seams as we speak, and I mean, there's so many different elements to this. There's how would a transition from this level of crisis and insanity towards a path of recovery look like, with the details, or just some of the, in a summary fashion, some of the details of this bank act towards an America utilizing a modern greenback system? What would that process of reorganization look like, if you don't mind?
Well, there's different ways to answer that.
Hmm.
One is that you would need the political will. And that would mean, in my opinion, I mean, the current political system in the US, and I think it's similar elsewhere, is totally broken. These two political parties that are so closely aligned behind the big financial billionaires is called the Uniparty for a reason. First of all, you need a new national unity government. Now, whether we have any chance of getting that in the near future, I don't know. But you would have to have, first of all, the political will. And because so many politicians and so many members of Congress are essentially on the payroll of the big finance companies, the big banks, the financial oligarchs, big pharma, the military industrial complex and everything, the system is totally corrupt. So you first of all have to have people who are able and willing to step in and change the political structure and the political ideology. That's a very tall order. Now, let me say one thing about the Federal Reserve System. You've got an infrastructure of Federal Reserve banks and computer systems and electronic funds transfer and all that could work under any system. Right now, they work for the big banks. They could work for the government monetary authority, which is what we call it in the Need Act. So you could transfer the entire infrastructure of the financial system over to a new leadership, a new umbrella organization that works for the public good rather than for private profit. So you've got the infrastructure there. You don't have to recreate it. In a lot of ways, it's very effective. You know, you can move money from A to B instantly, and that's a good thing. But you need the political will and the political structure, and then you need to step in. And Lyndon LaRouche, again, is a pretty smart guy. I only saw him speak once, but I read a lot of his stuff. He was part of my own awakening, I guess, back quarter of a century ago. But he says you have to put the whole system in bankruptcy reorganization. That's what you have to start with. You have to say this system is bankrupt. We're going to do these 10 things tomorrow to put in place a new superstructure to control the assets, to make the big decisions, but the whole thing is bankrupt. And the first thing you do when you declare bankruptcy is you decide what, if any, of the outstanding loans get canceled. Now, that brings me, if I could go on in that vein just a little bit, I have a new article coming out, I hope, if Sheer Post prints it, where I talk a little bit about this. And I refer to the ancient Greek lawgiver named Solon. And I don't know, it's a real interesting study to go back and look at what Solon did. The Greek, Athens was totally bankrupt. It was run by warlords and by big financiers who had everybody in debt. And back then, if you were in debt, you didn't pay. You were sold into slavery with your wife and children. Terribly cruel system. Well, Solon came into power. He was voted into power. He was an aristocrat. He was the RFK Jr. of his time, I guess you might say. And he had fought in, he had led Athens in war. So he had that aspect of support and credibility. He did two major things. Canceled all debts. Think about that. All debts are canceled. Now, if you want to deal with your creditor or your debtor on that basis and renegotiate maybe, all right, that's fine. But the debt is canceled. It was called in the days of ancient Israel a debt jubilee. Number two, he began to coin and distribute a central government-owned coinage. And back then, coins meant something because you didn't have such a huge economic system. But this was public coinage. When you went and bought something, you didn't have to go into debt to the moneylender or to the merchant or to the plutocrat. You had real, tangible, government-created, government-backed money. So those are two things. Cancel debt, create a monetary system based on the sovereign authority of the state, not of some big plutocrat or moneylender. You can do that today. And that's what the Need Act essentially does. And one of the provisions of the Need Act is we pay off the national debt. Now that means sacrifice. That means over time, over a certain number of years, we're going to pay people what we owe them. And that means less stuff that we get. But so be it. If our prosperity is built on 1 million debt slaves or 1 billion debt slaves, what use is it? Does that give us any real spiritual satisfaction? No, it degrades us. So we're going to stop that. We're going to pay our debts. We're going to create a sovereign currency where central authority can make decisions about where spending goes to create a productive, tangible, real economy of real working people, not this fluff of derivatives and speculation. It's disgusting, that system that we have today. So anyway, That's another one of my long answers. So
That's a fantastic answer. I'm actually going to make that a standalone video. I like it so much. That's great.
okay.
That's just great. Okay, let's give the last question over to Scott. I believe it's Scott in Vancouver. Scott, are you there?
Hello,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Wow, a great lecture. I just wanted to ask more about the original constitutional setup, of the government as a cameraless system, which is what you mentioned, Richard, about the in France and the nation building in France, which we, what I've come to understand, kind of really came down through Louis the 11th and his finance minister Colbert.
Well, the Louis the 11th came before Colbert, but I think we get what you're saying. Go on. Yeah.
Okay. Just that this and that took place in Germany later on. But he originally set up, if there's research work that you've done on, the original functioning of the Senate, as a body. I did some research on it some years ago, and the original Senate was set up to be peopled or elected, by representatives sent there by the state government.
right,
They were not publicly elected.
right.
Right. So then you and I asked some people about it, and they seem to Ron Paul seemed to advocate a return to this constitutional, government system. So I just wanted to get your comments on that.
Well, it certainly had its advantages, because so much of today's electioneering is just pandering to interest groups. You start with big donations from big business. Every senator, every congressman, representative, their first loyalty is to their donors. And so this raises the question of public election financing. And for quite a while, that's been a big reform element that people have talked about, is that you should have public financing of elections and take it out of the hands of the big donors. Well, if you did that, then maybe the current political system wouldn't be nearly as bad as it is now. And so maybe the Senate wouldn't be just another contest among rich donors. Taking a step back, say, the Senate system was flawed in the beginning, because you have two senators from the state of Wyoming, for instance, with a very small population, and then you have two senators from the state of New York with a very large population. So it's much easier for a senator to get elected in Wyoming, and B, he represents far fewer people. So that's another flaw in the system. There are people who've advocated a whole new constitutional convention for the United States. Now, I don't know how that would apply in Canada, but there are many, many flaws in the US Constitution, including this confusion over money that have kind of been sand in the wheels ever, for decades now, that need to be re-examined. So probably the whole Constitution needs to be re-examined. By the way, my publisher is in Vancouver, so hello if she's there.
All right, so Luke just slipped in like Indiana Jones under the closing wall. So Luke, we'll give you the last question. Go for it. Luke, are you there? You're on mute, by the way.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is just based on what you just mentioned. In China, they published, or the state published, a paper called China Democracy That Works. And I don't know if you're aware of this paper, if you read it or not, but what do you think we can, what we would get inspired from China if we were to do a new convention, constitution convention for the states?
Well, first of all, I know almost nothing about China. I have tremendous respect for China. Uh, and I guess I would mention a couple of reasons for that. One is if you study the history of the Opium Wars, it gives you a very, very good idea of how much the West exploited China back back in the well, I guess the 18th and the 19th centuries. I mean, just imagine taking shiploads of opium from India, which is what the British did, taking it to China, draining China of its gold because they demanded gold payment for this stuff. If the Chinese didn't cough up the money, they would burn their towns and kill their leaders. And then the US got in on the game, particularly John Jacob Astor, the famous Astor family. And what they did was they thought that Indian opium was too good for the Chinese. So they began to buy opium in Turkey and take this inferior Turkish opium to China and addict maybe millions of Chinese people to opium and take the gold back to the US. And I have read, and it's pretty convincing, that it includes Astor and not just Astor, because a lot of American families, particularly in New England, Rhode Island, Boston, made fortunes off the gold from selling opium to China. And I've read that a big source of capital for New England industrialization during the Industrial Revolution was Chinese gold they got from the opium trade. Now, if that's supposed to make us feel real good about ourselves, I don't think it does. So China has been a victim of the West for a couple hundred years, and they know this very well in China. They talk about the age of humiliation when the Americans and the British did this to all of those millions of victims. So that's one thing I think of when I think of China. That's in my book too. The other thing is, what happened under Clinton in the 1990s? Well, it had already started, but it actually started in Volcker's 1979 recession, when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates from 5 to 20% and destroyed American small business. And not just small business, some of our big industries, the steel industry. Clinton continued it. And it got worse in the 20th century under Bush and Obama, shipping millions of good, well-paying, productive industrial jobs from here to China. Remember when Walmart said, "Buy American, that's our motto"? Well, what became of that? Probably, I don't know. I did home rehab for a while, so I spent a lot of time in Home Depot. Made in China, made in China, made in China. A majority of the pharmaceuticals that lives depend on, made in China. And so we're threatening China. We're going to go to war against China when they make 3/4 of our stuff. It's insane. So Western policy toward China has never made any sense. And we've made China a superpower. And if China has money to invest in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, if they have money to build a Belt and Road Initiative, they got it from us. They got it from our consumers because all of our jobs went to them. And you know what the backbone today of the US economy is? It's the military industrial complex and the deep state. That's what our economy is based on. It's a catastrophe. So we're going to blame China and go to war against China because of this? Are we crazy? Yes, we are crazy. So that's all I can say about it.
Yeah. No, that's a sobering answer. And that's an important perspective to keep in mind. And people need to eat a lot of humble pie. I mean, we have no excuse to be in this position of complete basket case crisis. And are we crazy? I mean, in a short answer, yes. You said it. I mean, we have to admit that there's insanity that has become normalized. And otherwise, you can't account for how we've made all of the worst decisions of all the possible decisions at every step of the way since JFK was killed. It seems like we jumped into the worst of all possible worlds at every moment we had a chance. So
Absolutely right.
I think you've given us a good outline for the remedies to start undoing this disaster that we've brought upon ourselves. That doesn't involve creating a new enemy image out of China or Russia or some combination of China and Russia and Cuba, like so many are quickly leaping onto that bandwagon, and instead really just owning up to the responsibility that history and the future has given us.
But that was a great question on China.
Mm.
I really appreciate that. I mean, they're the next on the list, right? Next on the hit list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Jake Sullivan even Cynthia introduced me to a 2019 interview on some anti-China NGO was doing they interviewed him and he made the point. This is 2019, right? That we need a new enemy. There needs to be some unifying principle like there was in World War I and during the Cold War, and he's describing at length how, World War I was so great because everyone knew they had Germans as their enemy, and then the Cold War was great because we had Russia as our enemy. But since 1992, we haven't had a unifying enemy image. And he goes on at length saying, like, how great would it be if we only had aliens attacking us and we would all just be able to unite? But until that happens, we're going to have to make China our enemy. And it's like it's a win-win for everybody. It's something for the people who want to build back America and reshore. They're going to get a win. The military industrialists are going to get a win. Everybody's going to get a win. It's great. And it's like, well, how detached are you thinking? That's nuclear war. Who's going
to? Sullivan also said we need a new Pearl Harbor.
That's the same speech. Yeah.
Now, where have we heard that? 9/11, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what a Yale education will do for you.
Yeah. And then followed up by a douse of Rhodes Scholarship as well.
Right. Yeah. Capture America, recover America for the British Empire.
Exactly. Well, everyone, thank you all for joining us on this very enriching, edifying Sunday afternoon. And thank you, Richard, so much. I hope everybody buys your book and spreads the word. Next week, we have Nancy Spanis, who's going to go through some deep history into the battle against slavery regarding Hamilton, Franklin, and many others who had a very different idea from those pushing things like the 1619 Project. Around the New York Times are professing that U.S. is an invalid nation built upon hypocrisy, evil, and slavery. So that's a popular narrative being fed to a lot of young people, especially. So Nancy's going to nip that in the bud. So I think what you did today is going to be a nice little stepping stone for next week's lecture. So thank you, Richard, so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.